from their 1996 levels, using different baselines and going to different years. Countries like Canada and the United States say we need to start all over again because, of course, they haven't done any of these decreases in emissions. And almost all of the developing countries, so-called Annex 3 countries around the world, have said that this is unacceptable. That countries like Canada and the U.S. want to get away from any of their obligations and start negotiating something completely different with different values. Worst of all, there are a lot of side proposals as part of this global climate initiative that also threaten to have a lot of negative effects, a lot of impacts on different communities around the world. A lot of this climate change sort of solutions are being channeled through the World Bank right now. The World Bank is really trying to step up as to be one of the major sort of solvers of climate change. Meanwhile, they're doing about 10 times more to cause climate change in terms of financing oil, mining projects around the world. They want to be seen as the green saviors of the world and have a lot of that power directed into their agencies, with all of their, of course, negative history in especially indigenous communities around the world. The most threatening proposal is one called RED, and that one refers to reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And that was a proposal originally proposed by Brazil. Of course, has some of the biggest forests in the Amazon of any country in the world. Now, the basic proposal behind that, it sounds, when you hear people talk about it, they say, well, we just want to protect forests. But what does that actually mean? What does that mean to the UN? What does it mean to these countries? What's being proposed is that these countries would pay people who are cutting down trees to not cut down trees. And on the outset, it sort of sounds like a unique initiative, sort of out there a little bit. They tried to do that before with payment for environmental services, paying communities not to take other resources out. But what's really threatening about this is that the proposals being thrown around deal with amounts of billions, tens of billions of dollars being thrown to countries that have, in many cases, very bad human rights practices, and their major objective is to stop deforestation by any means necessary under these proposals. And countries like Canada and the United States have been fighting to make sure that Indigenous rights and the rights of other local communities are not part of this negotiation. That was one of the biggest. There was a big protest that was held in Bangkok at the last UN over that very fact. And so there's a lot of threat that a lot of these communities might simply be displaced, might simply be kicked out of the forests that they've always inhabited, simply because they don't have title to the land, or if they do, they can simply have that revoked by the governments, who all of a sudden have this new incentive to protect these forests from any sort of deforestation and degradation. Degradation including anything from traditional uses of forest, to picking up firebrush, to collecting foods. The other risky thing is that protecting forests is different than what you and I understand as forests. To the UN, forests include monocrop plantations. So if you go out and look in a place like Indonesia, where they grow millions of acres of monocrop but palm plantations, and places like Brazil, where they also grow soy and other products, they call these green deserts. They're basically farms of gigantic trees, and they have nothing to do with ecosystems. They're in fact an enemy of ecosystems. There's no animals, plants allowed to live there. They regularly spray them with pesticides, but these are considered forests and are considered things that countries can get money for offsets. When you say you're going to take a trip to Mexico and they offer you the chance to buy offsets, sometimes what you're buying is a little piece of property on that tree plantation that used to once happened to be the homeland of an indigenous community, or used to be an agricultural field, and is now a green desert and actually causing some of the worst ecological harm in those areas. These are the kind of initiatives, especially this RED initiative, that are being considered by agencies like the United Nations and the World Bank and a lot of countries around the world. And these are the kind of things that I think have some of the most risk when we just sort of go ahead and say, we must do everything we can to deal with climate change. In Canada, Canada is also very widely acknowledged as one of the worst climate criminals at these negotiations and internationally, and regularly receives the Fossil of the Year award when Canada shows up to the climate change negotiations. And that's mostly because of the tar sands here in Canada, quite frankly. Tar sands having been one of the main reasons that Canada's emissions have not gone down and will continue to increase over the next, over the course of the entire production of the tar sands, which could be indefinite, according to some companies' plans. And it's for the reason why pristine boreal forest, part of the largest forest ecosystem on the planet, has been turned into a moonscape in northern Alberta, where they've managed to pollute almost all of the waterways in the area and pollute a lot of the indigenous communities, the Dene, the Chippewa, and the Métis people who live and rely on the area and rely on traditional hunting and gathering for 80% of their food needs. They're being told that they can't hunt and they can't fish, nor can they take the water because it's so polluted. They found levels of mercury and arsenic 30 to 300 times the legal limit allowed in Canada in some of the animals there. And at the same time, they use about, I don't remember the exact statistics, but the amount of energy used is so tremendous that they're actually pumping in, they want to pump in natural gas to help power part of the tar sands, and there's even proposals to build a series of nuclear plants in northern Alberta just to power the tar sands, because it takes more actual energy to take the tar out of the ground than you get. So you're turning, natural gas, one of the cleanest, fuels that we have, and proposals for nuclear power to get one of the most dirtiest energies that we can possibly think of. And this has also contributed to Canada becoming, one of the worst per capita emitters in the entire world. And especially on the eve of these international negotiations in Copenhagen, I think it's an important point to really talk about, how do we create this message? How do we create this movement here in Canada? And there's a number of domestic actions that will be taking place up to Copenhagen and over the course of Copenhagen. In particular, we're organizing one with our Canadian Youth Climate Coalition and the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Power Shift Conference, happening next weekend. We're aiming to bring about 1,000 young people to Ottawa for 4 days and try and get them trained in the sort of message of climate justice, is kind of talking about building a new green economy and get them going back into the communities to sort of build a grassroots movement. But we're going to need a lot more work than that. And I think the other point of reflection there is that Copenhagen will be big. You're going to hear about it, probably a lot in the media. Myself, I'm planning to be there on behalf of the Indigenous Environmental Network. But I think that the kind of agreement we're going to get is not going to be one that's good for the planet. And so that we also have to consider, what are our expectations of Copenhagen and what kind of messaging comes out of it. A lot of people are starting to treat the United Nations climate change negotiations the same way that the World Trade Organization's talks were treated a while ago. So it's no longer talking about getting the best treaty possible for people, but avoiding some of the worst excesses. And I think that's something that we should should cause people to reflect upon. The United Nations negotiations, which most people have the most hope for, might actually be doing more damage than good. And so this year in Copenhagen, when people get there, there's a number of civil society groups from around the world, a number of indigenous communities, a number of agriculture communities, a number of women's groups, and civil society groups from all over the world who will be converging there to protest a number of the negotiations. And there's a widespread plan to try and change some of the messaging around how these kind of talks are understood and portrayed back here. Because I really think that, Copenhagen isn't going to be the end of, our worries about climate change, but it's really going to be the beginning, and the work is going to have to happen after that. And that's why I think we really need to be thinking and talking about, how do we create this movement back in Canada and internationally, especially in solidarity with countries in the Global South and communities who are going to be the most impacted. And how do we especially make it different from, the traditional environmental community, the traditional kind of, member of Sierra Club of Canada, we need to really make this a different kind of focused movement. We need to really make this a really inclusive moment, and one that reaches out to communities of color, First Nations communities, workers, everybody. And it really needs to be one that's focused on a message of climate justice, of environmental justice, of human rights, and of transforming these relationships that we have. And so I think that opportunities like this are an important step, but we really need to be thinking about this a lot and moving towards a lot more action on these items. And it's really now that we have the most important time to really try and shape the debate, shape how these issues are understood, because as this becomes a bigger and bigger issue, as I think it will, I think that we really have to be on top of the ball in terms of identifying what the real issues are, identifying what the real solutions are to climate change, and being able to reject a number of these false solutions to climate change, a number of the ones that might cause significant harm to ecosystems and peoples around the world. And just for wrapping up, I guess, then, I would encourage people to check out both of the organizations, PowerShift Canada, Clean Energy Climate Coalition, but also check out the Indigenous Environmental Network. Our website has a lot more resources and information on some of the work that we've been doing with Indigenous communities across the world. Thank you.